The second lesson, contrary to what it says in the bulletin, is a continuation of the lesson from Matthew. Pastors are allowed to change their minds midweek. I'm going to pick up where Steve left off. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than that comes from the evil one. May God add a blessing to this reading of the Word. I remember back when I was in college, in my early 20s, Jimmy Carter was the president, and for some reason, he granted an interview to Playboy magazine. Remember that? Yeah, those of you who are old enough to remember that. You sort of wonder what he was thinking. But the famous quote from that interview, when asked about something to do with sexual immorality or adultery, President Carter, Baptist Sunday school teacher that he was, answered, Jesus said that if you even feel lust in your heart, that you have already committed adultery. Well, that just went, things didn't go viral in those days, but it would have gone viral if viral was an option. It was in every single news source, and it was the topic of conversation for weeks in the newsletters and in the newspapers, and everybody talked about it. As though he were some kind of prude. It seemed to be somebody's agenda to make his Christianity look foolish. I think it was just a really humble thing for him to say, because what he wanted to avoid was judging other people for their lives and their choices. He wanted to suggest that he was just as sinful as the next person, whether or not he had ever committed a crime against Rosalind. But as a early 20-something person who had never paid that much attention to the Sermon on the Mount before, it sort of got my attention. Because I went to Matthew and I looked up that passage, and sure enough, Jesus said that. He said, if you merely look lustfully at another woman, you have already committed adultery. And I knew the kinds of stuff that was going on in my head at age 21 or 22. And even though I was not married, I wasn't necessarily just having thoughts about other people who were married, I knew that that was talking to me. And at 21 or 22, I knew the utter impossibility of controlling what went through my head. So I sort of, I said, what is Jesus talking about here. Because it's one thing to be able to control what you do in the world. That's a bit of a challenge, but at least it seemed doable. But Jesus wanted me also to control what was going on inside my overly active head, which was being controlled by my overly active hormones. What is Jesus talking about? What happened to the whole notion of saved by grace? What happened to the whole thing about, the law being our minder and our babysitter prior to the coming of Christ, and then this new thing happens? It seems as though Jesus is laying out the traditional law and then making it even harder to follow. Just prior to this morning's lection, Jesus says, if you want to be saved, you have to be even more righteous than the Pharisees and the scribes. And let me tell you, the Pharisees and the scribes, even though they could be kind of judgmental and hypocritical and unforgiving, they were pretty doggone righteous. They knew the law in all of its particularities, and they went to great lengths not to violate that law. And Jesus says, you want to be saved, you've got to be even more righteous than the Pharisees. Who can do that? Jesus says, you've heard it said that it's unlawful to murder somebody, and that someone who murders will be brought to judgment. But I want to tell you that the person who just feels angry enough to kill somebody has already sinned. Jesus says, if you are going to the worship, going up to the temple, and you realize that there's something broken in your relationship with another person, don't bother coming to worship. Go and fix your relationship before you come and worship God. Jesus says if you're on your way to court, if you're being sued for something, fix that relationship before you ever come before the judge, because if you come before the judge may hand you over to the guard who will toss you in prison, and you won't get out until you pay the last cent of that judgment. Jesus says, according to the law of Moses, a man can write a writ of divorce and put his wife aside. And it's as easy as saying, I divorce you 3 times. Jesus says, there's more here. I say to you, if you divorce a woman, you're forcing her to commit adultery. And if you marry someone who's divorced, you're committing adultery. There's something else here going on that's more important simply than the legal particularities. These are hard sayings, and they seem to fly in the face of everything that we understand about Jesus and his mercy and his grace and his forgiveness and his love for us. What is it that Jesus is getting at in these teachings? I want to suggest that Jesus teaches this way in order, first, to show us the foolishness of depending on our own righteousness for our salvation. He teaches this lesson in order to shatter the understanding that his disciples, most of whom grew up Jewish, have about the understanding of our righteousness before God. And he says at the very beginning of this, he says, "Don't think that I have come to banish the law. Rather, I have come," he says, "to fulfill it." But when he begins to teach this way, he is taking that understanding of, I can be righteous before God, I can be acceptable to God by avoiding the following behaviors and by engaging in this list of behaviors. If I choose only from column B and never from column A, God will have no choice but to accept me and to love me and to take care of me. If, on the other hand, I choose liberally from column A and sparsely from column B, I will come under the judgment of God. And it's a way of saying we have control over what it is that God will do. In order for people, in order for the followers of Jesus, in order for the Pharisees, in order for us to understand what Jesus has come to be and to do, Jesus has to smash that old paradigm. And the way that he does it is he says it's not enough not to murder somebody. You have to not want to murder somebody. It's not enough to not want to hurt somebody. To not hurt somebody, you have to not want to hurt somebody. He's moving to a deeper level of human existence. And he teaches this in various other places in his healings and in his teachings and in his parables, that what is important, what is significant, is what happens at the deepest level of a human being. He says about the Pharisees that they're like whited sepulchres. That's how the King James says it. They're like whitewashed tombs. You can paint them all pretty and white on the outside. You can put flower boxes under fake windows on the front. You can put a welcome sign with tulips on the front, and you can plant flowers in a garden bed in front of the tomb. But on the inside, there's still a rotting corpse, and it stinks. Jesus says, what goes on the outside is not enough. Transformation from the inside out is what is necessary. And in this teaching, Jesus takes us from the surface to what goes on the inside. It's not enough not to kill the person you're angry with. You need to become a person. Not who doesn't get angry, because that's impossible. But you can become the kind of person who treasures relationships, who cares about other people so much that you are committed to using your anger as a force for reestablishing relationships, for going past what is difficult to make a new relationship with another person. It is possible to harness your anger for good. But it requires you not just to do a new set of things. It requires you to be a new sort of person. I remember telling you a story not long ago about something that happened between my son Nathan and I when he was about 2.5. And he was pushing all my buttons, and I was just getting madder and madder and madder. And finally I picked him up and tucked him under my arm and stomped up the stairs into his bedroom, and I plunked him down in the middle of the floor, and I turned on my heel, and by the time I got to the door of his bedroom, he let out this animal cry of despair that was nothing manipulative about it. It was something that came from the depths of his soul, and I turned on my heel, and I don't even remember the steps between the door and him. In an instant, I was sitting on the floor holding him in my arms, and he and I were crying. That was not a conscious decision on my part. That was my better self emerging deep from within me to comfort my child. I gave up. In that moment, I gave up my jealousy about my power and my authority as a father. I don't take any credit for that transformation in that moment. But that's what Jesus is talking about. We need to go from being the person who is jealous of our own prerogatives and become that person who is solely concerned about who that other person is and how they are hurting and what they need. Jesus is taking us from the level of surface behavior down. When we go before the court and we go through all of the legalities and all of the dance that we do in court when we sue another person, all of that, and in a certain way, a certain kind of justice can come out of that process, and sometimes it is necessary, but it is a surface thing. Jesus wants you to understand that surface isn't where it's happening. He said, before you go before the judge, make a change in your relationship with your brother. If you owe him something, pay it. Jesus moves from the surface down to the essence of our relationships with one another. Restore the relationship, Jesus advises. It is impossible, Jesus says, to have a loving relationship with God if your relationships with one another are broken. So before you come to worship, fix your relationships with your wife, with your husband, with your best friend, with the person across the street, with that obnoxious person at work, with that person who annoys you at church all the time. Fix that relationship. Because you cannot have a relationship with the God who created you both until you have gone deeper and fixed what's broken. Most divorces happen long before a judge ever writes his name at the bottom of a piece of paper. Divorce happens because one or both parties in the relationship have made 1,000 little decisions to undermine, to ignore, to abandon the covenant that they made with each other. Jesus' remarks about divorce are not about going to a judge and getting him to sign a piece of paper and sorting out the legalities of two people living in separate lives. That's not what divorce is. Divorce is those day-by-day decisions to undermine, to break, to ignore, to not take care of. A set of covenant relationships which were intended to be forever. And if you've experienced divorce, you know that getting a divorce is not the same thing as getting unmarried. That in many ways you are connected to that person forever. When Jesus says the two shall become one flesh, he's not just kidding. Especially if you have children together. My wife, probably 45% of her work or more, is helping people sort out the new relationship after a divorce so that children can be nurtured and cared for, and it ain't easy. Jesus wants us to understand that it's not as easy as saying, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. But underneath, there are things that need to be healed, that need to be cared for, that need to be attended to, that are at the essence of who we are. Jesus understands that we cannot control the lust we feel, the anger that wells up in us, the sense of betrayal and abandonment. We can't control those feelings. He's not suggesting that some kind of new super 10 commandments where we not only don't do those things, but we don't think about doing those things. He's leading us to the place where transformation can actually happen. Where we become not people who do different things, but where we become a different kind of person. The law has no power to do that for us. The Ten Commandments, as worthy and wonderful as they are, cannot transform us. Only a relationship with the living God, whom we experience through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, through his self-sacrifice, through his powerful destruction of death itself. Only a relationship with the living God can transform us and make us acceptable in the sight and in the presence of God. We'll have more about this Sermon on the Mount next week, and I'll explore a little more deeply about what the nature of that transformation is like. Thanks be to God.